There we go. And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for tonight. We have an exciting program in store, webinar in store, but I just want to thank everyone who is a member of Lab Los Angeles Birders. And if you're not a member, I'd like to encourage you to become a member. It's really inexpensive, and you help support live and recorded webinars, live and recorded webinars like this tonight. You help support local field ornithology in the LA County and Southern California areas, and community science projects in these areas also. So, needless to say, we really appreciate your support. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Calvin Bond, who will be introducing our speaker for tonight. Calvin?
Thank you, Ron. Dr. Brett Furnas is our speaker. Dr. Brett Furnas is a research affiliate with the Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology at UC Davis, and a quantitative ecologist with the Wildlife Health Laboratory at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brett has collaborated with the Museum of Wildlife and Fish Biology for many years on the use of autonomous recording units for surveying songbird communities throughout the state. In his work at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, he advises on statistical design and data analysis for large wildlife survey projects of birds, bats, terrestrial mammals, plants, and other taxa, and leads studies monitoring the effects of climate change, fire, and other stressors on the conservation of wildlife diversity. Dr. Furnas holds a bachelor degree from UC Berkeley in physics and history, a master's degree in forestry from Yale, and a doctoral degree in ecology from UC Berkeley. Brett began his career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Lesotho, a landlocked country in southern Africa. Everybody please welcome Dr. Furnas.
Thank you, everyone. Actually, in Lesotho, in the Peace Corps is where I first got into birds, because I grew up a city kid in Northern California, and that was my first time in a rural area. And I really got to learning all the birds there. And so that's kind of stuck with me, even though these days now I work more on mammals and all types of species with population modeling. Birds and songbirds in particular are close to my heart. And I have actually quite a few in my backyard. I built a nest box for oak titmouse, and they've been within 3 days. And I got to see them lay their eggs, and they just fledged last Monday, and there's like 4 or 5 of the babies flying around my backyard. So I'm really
Wonderful.
Do something for that species. So
I'm sure the Cooper's hawks appreciate that.
Well, so there's Cooper's hawk too. It hasn't discovered them yet, but I did see the scrub jay try to take one out. So I'm not sure if it was successful. But then the American robins had the misfortune of trying to make their nest in the same magnolia tree, and they got chased away yesterday by them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's see if I can find it here. All right. I'll just go to slideshow.
And
do you see the slideshow, or is it still?
no, not yet.
Okay, maybe this is it. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. And now,
right.
Okay, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So I have 2 PowerPoints today. I've just kind of cannibalized them from talks I've given. This first one is on Swainson's hawk, and I'll go through that first, and then if there's questions, people want to have a discussion about that, I can. And if there's time, I will have a lot more slides on all different types of songbird research that I've been doing over the years, looking at trends and showing you a little bit about the methods using the sound recorders that we use for that. But so I'm sure lab members, you're familiar with this species, Swainson's hawk. You definitely see them in the summertime in Southern California. They're most abundant in California in our Central Valley. They is a species that has, suffered a decline over the last century, and they were as few as 375 breeding pairs in 1980. And at that time, our department was involved in getting them listed as a threatened species under the California Endangered Species Act. So this species, you'll find it in the summertime throughout other parts of North America, but in California, the decline was, and the numbers were really quite alarming in the 1980s. And actually, if you know anything about kind of conservation law, there's the Federal Endangered Species Act, but we also have the California Endangered Species Act. And so it was listed as threatened in, I think, 1983. And so that means we have to come up with a recovery plan, and take of this species is prohibited. And so the good news is that, as you can see from the title, there's been rapid growth since 2005. So this species is definitely recovering, and which is, it's not all doom and gloom. And even with all the changes, anthropogenic changes that we see, it's not monolithic. There's winners and losers, and you'll see that with the songbird stuff too. On average, raptors are in trouble globally, and they're declining on average, particularly in the tropics. But in North America, and maybe because of our Endangered Species Acts, both the federal and the state, and other states have them too. But conservation efforts seem to maybe be working for some raptors, because we definitely see, bald eagles and ospreys are bouncing back. Swainson's hawk, it looks like they're bouncing back too. So let's get into the details. So this is a real long distance migrant. So you can see this is, I think, from Birds of North America. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that Cornell site, but that's just amazing cornucopia of information about birds. I use it all the time. It tells you about their phonology, life history, great pictures, sounds, and also a range map here. So you can see in blue, that's their winter range down in Argentina, mostly other parts of South America. The migration range in yellow, and the breeding range in orange, and you can see throughout North America, but also in California. And you can see a picture of the Swainson's hawk right there. So we have been doing surveys. So my department, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, I mean, there's a federal one too. But in California, this is the branch or the Department of State Government that's responsible. It's the trustee agency responsible for the conservation of wildlife, which includes fish and wildlife species, and also botanical resources, plants as well. So we're responsible for kind of overseeing the stewardship, making recommendations when there should be protections. And so a lot of this, I'm a scientist, is to be able to monitor the population trends. If people want to know something about a species, the first thing they usually ask is how many of them there are. And you would think that would be an easy question. We'll just put tags on the ears, or go out and count them or something like that. It is amazingly difficult, right? And expensive and time consuming. And so most of the species in California, we don't know how many there are. We might have indices, general ideas and trends, but it is really difficult. And I don't think the general public understands, that we don't know how many of everything there is, but it is challenging. And that is actually my job, and my specialty in the department is I'm a quantitative ecologist, which means I'm a blend of an ecologist that kind of studies the natural history and interactions, food webs, things like that, population cycles of different wildlife. But I'm also a statistician. My PhD focused on that, is kind of the math, the coding, the modeling. One reason why this is necessary is because wildlife don't cooperate when you count them. So it's not like the census where you can go knock on their door and ask them questions. Well, first, I don't speak Swainson's hawk. He's right? And the other thing is that animals move around, they don't have addresses, right? And the other thing is they're cryptic, right? And so you might go out there and try to count them, and you're only counting some of them. And as birders, you guys know, sometimes you can misidentify species, right? I mean, even by sound, like, birds can mimic calls of other species. They move by quickly, they're in the trees, it's a skill, as you guys know, that you have to build up, and it's not easy. And so all of this makes it really difficult to count things. So we're kind of have had over the years since 1983, kind of different surveys in different parts of the state, but they're somewhat haphazard and not really, for the whole state or comparable. And so if we really want to see what the population trend is, we have to do it systematically the whole state. So starting in 2005 and 2006, we started doing that. And so we set up a design where we kind of sampled all the state. We broke it up into strata. So we used something called stratified sampling, where you can put different amounts of effort into different groups or strata. So we broke it up into what we presume to be kind of low density areas, moderate density areas, and high density areas. We did something called kernel density estimation, where we took all the records, a lot of them from birders like you and eBird and iNaturalist, things like that, and just kind of did a point process mapping of that, which you can see on the left, and looked at kind of the intensity of points within kernels. And that allowed us to kind of come up with this heat map on the left, which is just an index, but we used it to guide the strata that we would put different amounts of sampling effort into. So we put most of our effort into kind of the areas where there's the most variation, so in the moderate and high strata, but a lot of the area is low density, and if you just ignore that, you're going to have a biased estimate. So we had to put a sufficient amount of places where there weren't a lot of birds, and sometimes convincing biologists to do that as a statistician is difficult, because you're asking them to go out and count birds where they say there aren't any birds, right? And so, or at least not a good chance of seeing them. Like, people maybe want to go to birds where they know there's a lot of them. And so to get good science, you have to kind of spread out that effort. So you can see on the right, here's the results of surveys that were done in 2005, 2006, 2016, and 2018. And you can see the gray circles are all the locations that we went to look for and count Swainson's hawks, and black is where we found them. So high concentration in the Central Valley, also the Butte Valley up north. And we can go into the reasons for that, but a lot of that's kind of in the middle of the Central Valley. There is a lot of agricultural diversity there. So that's one thing that Swainson's hawks seem to like, is like a mix of different crop types. I think that provides good prey opportunities for them, for small mammals for them to prey on. Also alfalfa, where there's a lot of alfalfa, that there's a lot of water there, provides a lot of creates a habitat for insects that small mammals eat, and then Swainson's hawks can eat those prey. And also it's open, so they can not only have the prey there, but they have a good way of swooping down and getting them. Moving on to the next slide. So, well, actually, I should go back and tell you a little bit about the surveys and the method here. This is a classic survey where we're not using technology like I'll tell you about a little later with the songbirds, but we're actually just going out with our binoculars and looking for things. And so we searched square mile sections. That was the basic sampling effort. And then a biologist would go on separate occasions during the breeding season, like maybe when they had just arrived and they're starting to build their nests, and maybe later on they'd go back there and look if there are any nests established. And they would look for Swainson's hawks flying around in pairs and carrying nesting material and exhibiting behavior that would suggest that they're not just moving through there, but they're intending to breed there. And by spending kind of detailed time there, several hours driving around in there, they may find the nest or maybe not, but they can observe the behavior and observe individual pairs of hawks and estimate how many pairs of hawks were in that square mile section. Particularly in central California, things our land survey system of how land was given out to settlers here in California after the railways came through. We broke land in these square mile sections to like allocate them through various means, and so that's how we have kept track of land units, is through these 1 mile sections. They often have roads along them, so even if there was private property out here, you can drive along the roads, and with the binoculars that allowed the surveyors to be able to observe most of the area in the square mile sections and count the birds as best they could. So that this is kind of because getting access to land is difficult, right? You can't just trespass, and so this was a survey method was developed that we thought would work the best in an area that had a lot of private land in it. So a little bit of the math here. I won't go too much into it, but I used a generalized linear model, and I used something called a negative binomial distribution to model the distribution of counts. And it probably works well for things that, sometimes, most of the time there's no hawks, so there's lots of zeros, so you don't get hawks in most of the sections. But then some of them you have a variation in counts, and sometimes those counts could be, up to 5 or so, or, but most of the time like 1 or 2 or 3. And so I used something called regression. So we weren't just using sampling statistics here, we were actually modeling the association between where we found Swainson's hawks and the habitat attributes there. So alfalfa, whether there's a nesting tree. So like you had to have at least one nesting tree here, really, otherwise the Swainson's hawks would not use it for nesting. And so we actually used satellite imagery that could pick out where those trees were, and basically had a dichotomous variable for each square mile section where we did the surveys, whether or not there was a nesting tree available for them to nest in. And some other factors in there as well. I used year as a categorical variable to estimate population size each year. As I said earlier, it's really important to factor in detection probability. And so for a minority of these surveys, we had 2 independent observers at different times go and do those methods separately and compare the results. And that allowed us to kind of the disparity between whether one person got 0 pairs versus another one got 2, or both got 0, or both got 1. You can use something called an N-mixture model to estimate the probability of detecting one nesting pair if it was there. And so that's kind of an inflation factor. You could see if you found on average, 2 pairs, but your detection probability is on average 50%, then the true state would be that there are 4 pairs. So you really need to correct and treat the true state is what you're estimating, and that might be different from what you actually see. And so that's the factoring that in is really important. And you can see there was actually a trend in detection probability that if we hadn't factored it in, we would have seen more of a stable position and not an increasing one, because we had a lot of money in 2005 and 2006 to put into this. So we hired basically just, department biologists. We didn't hire them, they're already on the books, but they went out and do most of these surveys. In the later years, we're more strapped for catch. So, we use, volunteers like, folks like yourself, which it's fine, but like we got more variability in the detection probability, and it's still good data. It's just that you need to factor that in. And so you can see that detection probability was high in the beginning, about 70% of the time you would get it if it was there, but it went down to under 40% in the last year. So that needs to be factored in. So here is what we got. Estimated of about 19,000 breeding pairs. That's a lot of Swainson's hawks, right? But a pretty high confidence interval too, between 11,000 and 37. And you can kind of see the variation in the histogram there of kind of the range of predicted densities in terms of pairs per 100 square kilometers. So that's why it's important to have that negative binomial model, because in some places it's really high densities, but most of the time it's pretty low. So the innovation in this paper that you saw me citing at the very beginning is that we put this all together. We have these estimates for these 4 periods in time, and then we can look at a trend analysis. Now, it would have been better if I had surveys every year rather than just these 2 points, because you can argue there's definitely some leverage here. And there's pretty huge confidence intervals on them too. So, but you know, this, as a quantitative ecologist, I'd like to design surveys, right, to make sure that the confidence intervals are smaller, and we could have designed it to put the optimal amount of effort in. But oftentimes, you know, you're pulled in later in the project and just like, well, we really need help analyzing the data. And so I was kind of pulled in later in the project, but it still worked out pretty good that we got good results, that even though we could have been had more precision here, it's pretty clear that this population is increasing rapidly. So doing all the statistical magic, we're just, regardless of these uncertainty bars, the average annual growth is about 14% per year. And even with this uncertainty, the confidence interval is between 8 and 20%. So that is phenomenal growth, right? So this species is definitely bouncing back. I'm not totally sure why, right? I mean, does it have to do with something about pesticide use? Does it have to do something about what's happening in the winter range? I mean, there's another paper out by Dan Arola, I don't know if you guys know him, recently, who put some tracking devices on some of these Swainson's hawks and found that a lot of them were using stopover in Western Mexico, and that there's actually been a different type of agriculture, more diverse agriculture there in the last 20 years. And so that might be actually providing a stopover place for them as they come here. And that applies particularly to the California population. So there could be many things. We're not quite sure yet. We need to really look at that in more detail before like really thinking whether we want to change the listing status of this species. But overall, I think it's good news is that they are roaring back. And I've heard from other folks in Southern California that they've been seeing a lot more Swainson's hawks down there too. I would say in general, though, most of this growth has been happening in the Central Valley. Along the South Coast, there's still not that area used to be historically occupied. There's accounts of like tons of Swainson's hawks in like what is now Los Angeles County, you know, in maybe 100 years or 150 years ago. That doesn't seem like Swainson's hawks are moving into there yet. So your group, that might be something like keep an eye out for them. I think there was one nesting pair maybe at Seal Beach in Orange County. But that if this recovery is robust and not like an ecological trap that's going to turn around, seeing them moving into the South Coast will be important. That's all I have for Swainson's hawk. I'm happy to answer questions at this time or move on to songbirds.
Yeah, we've actually
say?
gotten a couple of questions, and I have a couple of questions. First of all, before we get to their questions, you're talking about the population of Swainson's hawks specifically in the Central Valley of California, not in all of North America.
Right, and all of California, right? So there is like 19,000 Swainson's hawks in all of California. We were not talking about the population trend in North America, but historically we know that for whatever reason, the California population over the last 100 years like cratered down to 375 in 1980. And I don't think it went down as deep in other parts of North America. So the conservation issue with them and the worry has primarily been in California, and now they seem to be doing well.
Okay. Ken Ely up in Davis says from his backyard he can still see the neighborhood pairs soaring about. What is the time period for nesting for Swainson's hawks? Do you know?
I don't know for sure, but I think it is probably, I think it's probably the high peak of it might be in April or May, but I am not sure.
We had, as you may know, Lance Benner, who's on the call. Lance organized a tracking of Swainson's hawks through LA County, and our peak was mid-April.
Oh,
So I presume it would take him another week or two or so at least. Um, the vast, oh, there we go. Mid-March. Oh, mid-March peak. Okay, thanks, Lance.
I'm just saying because I think the surveys were timed to be like like March, April, maybe late May.
Okay, okay. Ken also asks, do you have any thoughts, estimates, or predictions of the impact of alfalfa acreage being replaced with nut trees on the population growth?
Yeah, so nut trees are negatively associated with Swainson's hawk, right? Or at least that's, and that's what people say that, just because like they can't hunt as well in with that denser canopy. And what is a little puzzling is that at the same time that this increase is being going up like a cannonball, the same thing has been happening with nut or orchards have been expanding as well. So
Oh,
I
really?
can't, yeah, so it's a little contradictory. But what I will say is that I've also noticed for like other taxa, like bats and songbirds in the Central Valley, that these orchards are actually being disproportionately important for those taxa during droughts. So you see bats and birds switching use to orchards during droughts, maybe because they're providing water. So I don't,
Oh,
maybe there's something going on there that I don't fully understand. But in general, Swainson orchards conversion from alfalfa or from natural grasslands and riparian habitats is not supposed to be good for Swainson's hawks. And in our models and in our looking at associations of where we found Swainson's hawks and where we didn't find them in orchards.
Lance also points out that many Swainson's hawks were documented moving through Borrego Valley, as you know, down San Diego area, well into April, but large numbers were not seen moving through Los Angeles County during that month. So,
I
it's
think that mirrors what I was saying earlier. Like, I think we are seeing them in like Antelope Valley or to the, places a little inland, but not in I mean, there is habitat like, along in Orange County along the coast that should be good for them. So we don't know what's going on there.
yeah. We're definitely trying to get our hands on migratory routes for Swainson's hawks and all that. Scott asks, what role does the wintering population in the Central Valley contribute to their success? They don't have to migrate, might have early access to breeding sites, less risk encountered with migration, etc.
Yeah, I thought they mostly migrated. I didn't know that there were some that did
I
not.
didn't realize there was a wintering population.
But I mean, wildlife is adaptable, and like we see this with deer and other things, like switching from migratory to non-migratory behavior, and like there's a reason why wildlife would put a lot of energy into migrating, particularly up to places where there's seasonal availability of resources. But like if that calculus changes, I mean, they can make their own decisions to some extent.
Laura comments that she saw a kettle of about 25 to 30 Swainson's hawks over the mountains just east of Altadena on April 1st. So we were having numbers still coming through on April 1st. Beth asks, is there something distinctive about their flight pattern?
I don't know. I can't really answer that. I mean, we do have some data from Dan Arroyo's paper about where they stop off and how long they stop in different places. But I would say citizen scientists or community scientists, that information you're mentioning, put it in eBird, or if you have your own group way of compiling data. I mean, that is the data of the future. I haven't used Bird much, but I've used iNaturalist a lot. And it is really valuable data, kind of the era of big data science and using methods for that is like, we can use it and we can correct for biases. So like it used to be that people just discounted community science and said, well, yeah, it's great, but they're all doing it in town, or they're not doing it randomly or whatever.
Right.
It's like we can, as long as we can model the sampling process that you're using, we can use the data. And so our computer modeling and our statistics is getting better, so we can incorporate all of the data. And so it's great that you guys have those observations, because they're definitely useful.
Yeah, and besides iNaturalist, we're really into eBird as well,
Yeah.
which is a great resource. James asks, could an organic farming increase explain the Swainson's hawk increase?
Say that again. I missed that.
So, as organic farming increases, could that explain why Swainson's hawks are increasing?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, just like where the most of the Swainson's hawks are is where there's agricultural diversity, right? And organic farming or small scale farming is diverse, and that's going to lead to, more prey species, and it also provides good kind of natural habitat for Swainson's hawks to hunt. So I can't prove it, except that, we didn't test for organic, but I think that's good. And I also know that chemicals have some big impacts, particularly maybe not so much on Swainson's hawks, though it has in their winter range, but like for grassland birds, their decline is linked to use of neonicotinoid pesticides. So organics don't have that. So I would think it would be good for many reasons.
Yeah, really devastating.
Yeah.
Yvonne asks, can you give an example of how you correct for bias in citizen science reports?
Okay, so there are two types of error, type 1 error and type 2 error, right? And so type 2 error is more easily dealt with. It's detection probability that I mentioned. So it's the probability that the bird was there, even though you said it wasn't there. So you said there was a 0, but it's actually a 1, right? And so what you can do is, if you do repeat surveys, or like what we had 2 observers, you can kind of look at what percentage of the time, if I mean, I only had 2, but say that you have 10 observers and they all go out and look at it, and 5 of the 10 observers found the Swainson's hawk. Well, if that Swainson's hawk was there at least once, it's there.
Right.
And you can correct that at 50% of the time you're going to get it. So then you can divide by that and inflate things up. Well, the bigger problem is misclassification, right? So if you went out there and said there's a Swainson's hawk, but it was really like, a juvenile red tail hawk or a different color morph or something like that, that has really screwed up the data. And so how do you deal with that? And so you basically then look at multiple people's reports. So we have been doing this with eBird, not me, but other people. So you can have like a quadrat, like the square mile or something else, and look at all the eBird lists in there. And I guess what you would do is you would have to have some idea of what the truth was. So maybe, maybe independent method where you actually had nets or something, or DNA or something like that, that you could indisputably say the bird was there. Then you can kind of see what is the percentage of the time that misclassification happens.
Oh, okay. Okay.
This is used a lot with machine learning methods now, like that you see with Merlin and all these other software that try to tell you what your bird is if you play it on the cell phone or with our sound recorders. So you need annotated records of what you think is the truth, and then you can compare against that.
Okay. Okay, interesting. Lily asks, do you think the non-breeding range has changed due to climate change?
Well, that's what I would expect, right? Because like, particularly in your area, your deserts have been hammered with climate change. Like I think it's already 2°C up in the last 100 years in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, right? And some papers showing that the songbird community there has collapsed, right? And birds are moving to higher elevations there in your intermountain, the mountain basin ranges, right? So, the climate change hasn't hit everywhere the same. Like actually up in our northern forest, we probably have some refugia up there and less of that. But so I would think that may be one reason that Swainson's hawks haven't come back to Southern California. So I don't know. I think that would be more inland. I mean, how bad are things with climate change along on the South Coast? I don't know. But that is certainly, you would definitely see that. We're seeing birds all over the place changing their ranges.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. Yvonne asks, can you give a real life example of actually, you probably answered this. Can you give a real life example of correcting for bias in citizen science reports?
Yeah, so that would be where I work with a postdoc student at Berkeley to look at eBird lists and overlap them with something that we thought was higher quality or something that was consistent. So we actually did some surveys based on sound recorders, and we had an expert listen to those recordings and write down the species, not using machine learning. And so he has a pretty good ear, and we just limited to those species that he was 100% confident with, and then looked at the same area with the overlap. So that would be what I spoke of earlier.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And Becky asks, do pairs tend to return to the same nest trees? And are there any banding programs for Swainson's hawks?
I know that there was some work to put some the geolocators on them, which is kind of like a light diode that is lightweight, right? You have to recapture the bird. So usually whenever you capture a bird for any purpose for these methods, you put bands on them. I know that there's a variety of programs that kind of birds during migration. The MAPS program, it mostly is songbirds, where they put up mist nets. But there's one up in my neck of the woods in the Bay Area. I think it's the Golden Gate. Well, it's in the Marin Headlands. There's a group there. It's for educational purposes, but also science. There's a choke point. Like birds don't like to fly over the water, so they kind of fly to the isthmus of San Francisco across where the Golden Gate Bridge is, right? And they're coming down there, and so they net a bunch of hawks. Maybe not Swainson's hawks, but definitely lots of accipiters and other bootios, and those are banded.
Yeah, and Yvonne, I believe it was. Yeah, Yvonne pointed out it's Golden Gate Raptor Observatory.
That's it. That's a great group. They not only do this good science, but it's like citizen community science and like tons of school groups and just getting anyone involved. And so they're a great group.
Fantastic. And now that we've finished sending all these questions at you, I think we finally have slowed down. If you want to present on
do I have time to do another PowerPoint, or do you just want me to kind of talk about it verbally? Or I'll see. I can at least do a few of the slides.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And any other questions that come up, either for everyone out there, either on Swainson's hawks or on songbirds that we'll be getting, please put them down in the Q&A. That helps me kind of keep track of everything.
All right, I am going to see if I can get the technology right this time. All right, so you can see that. Let's see if I can launch the. There you go. Can you see that all, everyone?
Yeah, now it looks great.
So this is what I've done actually through most of my career, is multi-species biodiversity monitoring using sensors. So on the top, you see all those songbirds. let's see, mountain quail, olive-sided flycatcher, hairy woodpecker, my favorite, the Hermit Warbler, and American robin. But I've been also worked with cameras a lot. So black bear, we were talking about that earlier. My favorite, the fisher, and then also elk, but all different types of stuff, and mostly through forested areas in Northern California. So starting in 2002, our department has been putting out these sound recorders and cameras at just truly random locations all across the forest on public lands like national forests, national parks. But also we got, through lots of discussions and building trust, got a lot of private landowners in those forests, particularly timber companies, to allow us to go out there and put sound recorders on there. The idea is that, we might not always agree on what's the best forest management approach for biodiversity, but like, let's work together and let's get the data, and then we can argue about it, right? And so we have been doing this since 2002 for sound recorders, because basically if you can record the dawn course, you can ID a lot of species. So we basically get 100 species of passerines in our Northern California forests from these sound recorders. That when I started out doing this, it started in 2002. I got involved in 2004. Out of our Redding office in the Klamath Mountains, the Southern Cascades, Northern Sierra, millions of acres of land up there. And we were using tape recorders, right? Pressed in, you remember how you had to push them down in the play and the record position? I mean, do you guys remember that with cassette tapes? And so then we had those tape recorders out in the forest, hooked up to a lawn sprinkler timer, an old Orbit lawn sprinkler timer. So it was programmed to go off 30 minutes before sunrise for 5 minutes, then again at sunrise for 5 minutes, and then 30 minutes after. And we repeated this on 3 consecutive days. So if you heard my little spiel about detection probability, now I have 9 replicates. And if you hear the robin once, how often do you hear it in the other 9 recordings? And that will give you an estimate of detection probability. So some birds are vocal, some aren't. Like robins like to sing first thing in the morning because it's too early for them to be getting worms, right? So they go up to the top of the tree and then they sing to attract a mate. Hermit warblers, right here, they forage not on the ground like robins, but on the tops of trees. And so they can kind of, eat all day and sing all day, because the best acoustics are on the top of the tree. So they can kind of get up late, and they're more vocal, frankly, between 8 and 10 o'clock than they are, 30 minutes before sunrise. So you can kind of put everything on an equal footing in terms of the rate of how often you hear things sing. So, of course, over the years, we've moved on to using other types of recordings, not just the tape recorders. So you can kind of see the scope of how long we've been doing this, and just the hundreds and thousands of sites that we've done this. And this is expanding. Other people are doing this now. A lot of people are getting into using ARUs, or automated recording units. They work well for birds, also for bats, other coyotes, and now wolves that are coming to California. We can use it for them too. I'm not going to get into it, but we use camera traps. I've used visual searches for amphibians. We pick up poop and sequence the DNA. We use helicopters and drones with cameras to count deer and things like that, pronghorn antelope. So here's what one of our more modern ARUs looks like from 2016, using wildlife acoustics. We put it on a pole. This was when we did it in the Mojave Desert. You can see there's 2 microphones there. The lower one is an audio microphone, and the other one on the top is an ultrasonic that goes all night to record for bats. I won't get into the bats, but that lower microphone is what we use for birds. And now we use these song meters over here that are much cheaper and work about as well as these other units. We look at the spectrograms. We have just been doing this manually, so brute force. That's why we only have these 5-minute recordings, because they're manageable to go through. A lot of people nowadays are just having these things on all day for a month, right? And that will give you more data, but then you really have to develop machine learning methods. And you know, they're good, but there's a lot of variety in, you know, birds don't have one vocalization, they have multiple vocalizations. And as I'll show you with Hermit Warbler, there's dialects too. So we've just had experts look at these sonograms, and you can kind of see examples of the dark-eyed junco, the Olive-Sided Warbler, and the western tanager here. And that allows us to create detection history, where you have the sites or the different places you want to see whether they're there. And then you have these replicated surveys, which are the detection history. And then I use that occupancy modeling method to correct for detection probability. At the end of the day, this is how we use all of this information. Here is basically a baseline species occupancy distribution in rank order. So you can kind of see occupancy here means the probability that a bird is a particular site. So if it's at 0, it's nowhere. If it's 1, it's everywhere. So you can see the ones on the left are the more common species. On average in Northern California, in the Southern Cascades and Klamath Mountains, western tanager, stellar jay, dark-eyed junco, red-breasted nuthatch, mountain chickadee, and yellow rump warbler are the kind of the super abundant species there. Those are the dominant species that the dominant passerines in this meta community. But there's also an enormous number of moderately abundant species, which are basically the rest of the species that you see on this chart. And I've truncated it at like about 10% or 0.1, a 10% probability of it being at any particular place. There's, like I said, 100 species. So there's lots of what we call singletons that are only found at one site or so. And so if you know anything about biodiversity theory, this is kind of how you assess it. So the shape of this curve, the evenness of it tells you how diverse something is, and it really tells you something about how healthy a system is. So there's different ways of looking at diversity: alpha diversity, gamma diversity, beta diversity, and also something called evenness or Simpson's measure or Shannon's diversity index. And it has to do with like how sharply this drops down, this curve, versus how flat or even it is. And this is a pretty even system. So it's a testament that these Northern California forests have a lot of niche space for kind of overlapping of many species. So there are pretty strong, diverse habitats. And we are finding that in climate change, there are a lot of species that are, and it's providing refugia for them. I'll get into that in more detail next. Let's see what's going on in the slides. I think I'll skip over this in the interest of time. I'll show you this one. This definitely shows that there's different migratory guilds are using different elevation bands. So you can see that there, as you would see, the altitudinal migrants, like robins, are moving from lower elevations to higher elevations. And this one on the right, I think I'll focus on it, shows you the effect of temperature on the singing activity of birds. And so what we're finding, if you see the neotropical birds, they do not change their singing behavior on hot days, whereas birds that are there all year will stop singing on hot days. But on hot days, the long distance migrants, they have a truncated phenology, a shortened period of time that they've got to, fatten up, find a mate, build a nest, reproduce, fly home. And so if it's hot, they really don't have any flexibility to stop singing, right? And so that's one reason that they could be more vulnerable to climate change. You could also argue that they're adapted to that. They are from the tropics and they can deal with hot temperatures, right? But there's only so much plasticity that they have. And I'm worried under climate change that Even though they seem to be adapting well right now, at some point that could have an impact. So this shows that long distance migrants are probably the group of birds that they were most concerned about. And so I have a 14-year trend here where we've looked at from 2002 to 2016, using all of that ARU data at all of these sites in Northern California, about 1,000 of them that you can see here. There are winners and losers. And so you can see the winners on the top in terms of you can see what their occupancy was in black in 2002 and what it was in the hollow circles in 2016. You can see the species that seem to be increasing are some of those super abundant ones like Western tanager and dark-eyed junco and raven. That's being shown. I know they're increasing in the Mojave Desert as well. So some are actually adapting, and some of those are adapting by moving upslope. So you can see the ones with the U's, those ones are moving upslope, right? And so that's like a local adaptation to climate change. So that might be one reason why they're doing okay. But there's also losers, right? And so the one I really want to highlight in here is the olive-sided flycatcher. That is dropping at 4% per year, and it's moving to higher elevations, trying to adapt, but it's going to run out of habitat at some point. Interestingly enough, that one is an aerial insectivore, and we know that bees are declining too. So there might be something related there. But this is the exact type of information that we really need to prioritize our conservation in terms of knowing which species are benefiting maybe from the chaos of climate change versus the ones that are really suffering. I'll skip over this and get right into Hermit Warbler, which is really, I'm mostly a statistician that counts things, but like Hermit Warblers is really where I get out in the field and really do birding, I guess, right? And the science associated with that. So the reason I got into this, because the sound recorders, we could not tell Hermit Warblers apart from black-throated gray warblers because they sound similar in our northern forests and they have so many dialects. And we already know from other research that have this type 1 song to attract a mate. And it's usually, so it has to be really stylized that they imprint upon it when they're younger. Maybe the females, they hear the males around them and that's the song that they know is right for their area. And so the males try to copy that stylistically perfectly. And you can kind of see what that looks like with a first phrase that's repeated elements and then a flourish at the end. And so we went all around California to at 100 sites to use parabolic microphones to record the species. This is actually at the height of the pandemic. I was out along a trail in the Bay Area where there's redwoods and along the peninsula, so I had the mask on. But we went to many other places throughout California, and we came up with, we recorded about 1,500 birds, and we're able to describe 35 different dialects. And so this will be really useful for not just monitoring species, but understanding how songs vary. This is probably an epiphenomenon for habitat specialization, and there's probably a genetic basis for it. We've also found that what other people have described is that there's a single dialect in an area. But we were finding that sometimes there are two males that were trading songs, right, to, or they were trying to attract mates and they were adjacent to each other, but they're singing different songs, different type 1 songs. That doesn't make any sense. Why is that happening? And so we're able to find out that over time, like with island biogeographic theory, these birds have separated because maybe they specialize in foraging in different forests. And then over time, their songs have drifted and become different. But what mixes that up is disturbance, and specifically fire. Hermit warblers are really sensitive to fire in the short term. Even if it doesn't destroy the stand, it might do something to remove their prey and their insects for a year or two, like this picture right up here. But they will come back in a year or two, but it leaves a vacuum. And so then more than other populations of birds might come in. And so then you end up with two birds singing a different dialect. And so for dynamic diversity to be maintained, it's important to have isolation, but also mixing. And so fire is really important in our forests and for development of our ecology here. This is an example of how it helps to mix that up and maintain that dynamic diversity. So with that, we probably went on a little too long, but hopefully you find it interesting stuff. I'm happy to answer any more questions if there's any time.
No, it's really interesting stuff. And actually, I brought on our dialect specialist to pepper you with questions,
All
which is
right.
kind of ironic because I can't understand a thing he says. Lance, you want to?
Yeah, Brett, my name is Lance Benner. I do a lot of audio recording in the San Gabriel Mountains
Great.
and also in Maine when I'm back there. And I've been using audio moths and song meters for about 3 years, as well as shotgun mics and a parabola. And I've
Great.
also been doing a breeding bird survey route for about a decade.
Well,
So-
if you find any hermit warblers, they sing the V dialect according to our rubric, but we need more data from them. So if you ever come across them, that parabolic microphone and record them, we'd be happy to use that data.
We've actually put a small number of recordings into Xenocanto and eBird from the San Gabriel Mountains already.
Excellent. Excellent.
And there are a couple places on my breeding bird survey route where I detected them over the years, although not very consistently. So the point that I made in the chat, which I wanted to ask you about, is early on in the songbird part of the talk, you showed a figure from your paper from 2018 that using the autonomous recording units gave a sense of the abundance of different songbirds in the northern forests. So I'm curious to see how that compares with what was observed by people who were doing breeding bird survey routes in the same areas. Were there
I actually did a
differences?
comparison, and what we did is we found that they didn't line up all the time, right?
Yeah.
And I think what I did is, this was in the 2020 paper where I showed you the winners and the losers, where I made that comparison, that I actually didn't look so much at what you found, but I looked at the trend, right? And so if I found a declining trend, did breeding bird survey find a declining trend? And there wasn't really great agreement. And this makes me worried that maybe the breeding bird survey, it's great because it's so extensive. It's really it has been the only game in town in terms of like informing listing decisions about things, right? But it's along roads, right? And that's going to potentially be biased in terms of, is that representative of these forested areas? So I think it has worked well for like Swainson's hawk, because we got the similar trend for Swainson's hawk as breeding bird survey. But for forest birds, a lot of them are maybe away from birds. We did not get the same results. So that my sense is that there's limitations to breeding bird. It is good, but it's along roads.
Yeah, and no pun intended, because it literally is along the road. Yeah.
And also, they don't really have a very good way of addressing detection probability. They have a sort of a way. They have a wonderful, brilliant quantitative ecologist, John Sauer, I think, who works on trying to adjust detection probability, but they don't have in the design repeat visits, right? I mean, if they could get people to drive those visits, and I mean, maybe they do repeat visits, but I think that there's not enough of them that they have been able to include that in their detection model.
Well, basically the route is once a year.
Once a year. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then that's a limiting factor there. But I'm not going to knock that data. It is being instrumental to conservation. You just have to know when maybe it's limited and when it has its strengths. But very good question.
Yeah. I think we're out of questions.
I have a question.
Oh, sure. Go, Calvin.
I was wondering, in your Hermit Warbler research, did you find like each dialect was sort of evenly distributed, like between all the 35 dialects, or was certain dialects like much more common than others?
98.
Well, it was a little bit subjective on how we classified them, and we're going to be working with some researchers to kind of use machine learning to look at that in more detail. But I did see a pattern that there are some places where what I would say is there's kind of these super dialects that were expanding and had kind of taken over a place. And then there are other places where there's just a high diversity of like these just local dialects that were only in a few places. And so, but you see that everywhere, like even with the letters of the alphabet, right? And if you do code breaking or whatever, there's lots of A's and M's and not very many Z's and X's, right? And that's the way, I mean, you saw the distribution of the species that I had. There's a few common and it drops off. So that is not a surprise. That is the kind of a law of diversity, is that there's a few common things and lots of rare things. And we do see that in the dialects too, is that there are a few super extensive dialects, particularly what I would call the L dialect throughout all of this northern Sierras. It's the classic Hermit Warbler song that's very tonal that you hear on a lot of the recordings is mostly kind of from Lake Almanor down to Yosemite.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Thank you so much.
If you're interested, you could go see that paper. It's on, it's in OC, which is now, I think, ornithological application. And I think the supplemental material, you have this rubric of all the songs, and I have wave files of all those 35 dialects, so you can go listen to them if you want.
Fantastic. Oh, I think another question may have popped up. Yvonne asks, during your huge survey of hermit warblers, did you encounter Hermit Townsend warbler hybrids as in Oregon and Washington? And if so, how did you sort out their dialects?
Well, I only got one of them because I actually did do some sampling where I got mist nets and I got their feathers for doing stable isotopes and some genetic samples too. To follow up on whether this song is just cultural or genetic. Mm-hmm. And of those about 160, I actually was able to kind of look at their feathering, their plumage patterns. One of them was definitely a hybrid. It was very close to the Oregon border. If you know where Ruth Lake is along Highway 96, that's where the one, I mean, it's probably only like 20 miles from the Oregon border. That's the only place that I found a Townsend warbler, Hermit warbler hybrid. And other people's research has pretty much found them down in Oregon and Washington. So California is probably like the last place on the planet where, you know, Hermit warblers that aren't hybridized are still dominant, right? And so, because this species has a pretty small range historically from California up to, you know, British Columbia, the southern parts of it, and most of that area has hybridized with Townsend. So that I am worried about the species. They are resilient. There are lots of them, probably several million in California, but they're only in California, and to the north of them they have hybridized. I wasn't able to. With a sample size of one, I haven't seen anything in the songs.
Yeah.
I think there's some studies up in Washington that have looked at that recently, but I have not.
And in the chat, Calvin put, there's the link to the Hermit Warbler research. You might want to grab that before we finish tonight.
Hey, Ron, I had another question.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Lance again. So you mentioned using machine learning to scan through the files, the audio files, to identify things. Did you train the machine learning yourselves, or I mean, how did you do that? Because that's an enormous amount of work for 100 species.
Yeah, I haven't done it yet. I mean, I'm not actually. When I was doing my PhD, like from 2006 to 2012. Like machine learning hadn't really hit, so I really focused on this detection probability thing. It's called hierarchical modeling. So I kind of missed the whole machine learning boat. So I don't know much about that, but I have been working with a lot of people that do know about it. And I can tell you it is just amazing amount of activity going on with that. Like Cornell, people in Europe, people at the University of Berg, Point Blue, conservation science, a lot of people they're spending a lot of time trying to figure that out. But it is a challenging problem, and you know, I don't think it's being solved yet. It's being solved for camera traps and images, but not for songs. So it is a lot of work. I am working with a group that I would give them my Hermit Warbler data, which is annotated to the, because I have 1,500 birds with annotated what their dialect is. And you usually need like about 1,000 of something for machine learning to work. It just needs a lot of data.
Yeah.
But I'm not an that, so you're right, it's difficult, and I'm still a little skeptical. But I've been told something called the bitter lesson, that machine learning, like given enough data, will figure most things out.
So did you actually use it for all those birds that you mentioned in the northern part of the state?
No, we had a person listen to all of that. But that's why we only did 5-minute recordings, because it took a very long time.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, as I wondered about that, because I typically use 20-minute recordings, and for a typical survey that I'm doing, it usually goes for at least 4 hours and sometimes all night.
Well, so I would say the average for listening to a 5-minute recording, when you have expert people doing this, is about 10 minutes per recording, but they can't do it more than 4 hours, you know, and it really requires a dedicated individual. But that's the kind of the challenge of big data, you know, even with my small amount of big data, but we just had people, and it's been taking a lot of time, and I have a backlog of probably 5 years of data, just because I can't get, you know, it's hard to find people that have the time to listen to all this stuff.
Yeah, interesting.
One final question: are you going to archive those recordings in public someplace, so they can be used for, you know, by future researchers?
Yeah, they're archived on our website, or not on our website, but on our servers. But I've been talking to the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley for them to curate that, because you know, there's a certain skill to being a data scientist that I'm not, and also just being a museum curator, they do a better job at curating that. So yeah, we'll definitely be doing that. I don't want this to be shoebox data that gets lost when I retire.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And as Lance said very succinctly, thank you very much. It was a wonderful, wonderful dual presentation tonight. And
thank you. That was really interesting. A lot of great food for thought for citizen sciences, community science too.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you so much. That was incredible.
bottom line, can we expect to see more or less hermit warblers in the future?
I say optimists, they seem to be doing well. They're not declining. They were the ones with no trend in my slide a few minutes ago about winners and losers. But I'm worried about them because of the hybridization, and they had such a small summer range in California, but they seem to be doing well.
Well, we'll hope that continues. And once again, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. It's been a wonderful evening, and I hope you join us for the next webinar. Until then, good night, everyone. And thanks again, Brett.
Thanks. I really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.